This is Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur with your host, Lynn Freest. Lynn will share ideas and expert advice from people that are walking in your shoes and living their encore careers, where they want and at the pace they want. You'll start a company of one with confidence and knowledge to live a fulfilled life of freedom and ease. Lynn is a coach and leadership consultant whose mission is to show senior leaders and experts how to start something refreshing and new after a full career in the corporate environment.
Welcome to this episode of Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur. Thanks again for listening. With an encore career, the rewards are better than a cold beer on a hot day. And you can be creating value in the world beyond just winning the next pickleball game. You can work when you want, where you want, and you can do the work you love. In other words, you can live the dream. So if you're ready to get started, please contact me at lynn@lynnfreest.com. Well, this is episode 174, and it's why I'm using questions rather than goals for 2023. So we'll go into a little bit of that, but I wanted to just start off by sharing my questions for 2023. I've got personal and then my encore career questions. So in the personal arena, what do I want my life to look like? How and where can I serve with the greatest value? And how do I make that need into a reality? In the encore career arena, I've got 4 questions. What are the key demographic issues for encore careers? How can I use my knowledge of some recent courses in transitions and developing purpose to help people in developing their own encore careers? What are the key skills or technologies needed for an encore career? And how can I put more definition into what a portfolio career looks like as part of an encore career? Stepping back for a minute, why do I want to focus on questions? Well, I've recently run into a book again, reintroduced to a book called A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger, and had some conversation and online course on purpose about the power of questions. Another book that I've had read some time ago is called The Highest Goal by Michael Ray. He's a professor at West Coast. And his key concept was not so much goals, but he called them live-withs. And really, they're just living with questions is what he intended. And I'm doing this because in my business life and personal life, I think we tend to race to one answer or the answer. And sometimes that just narrows our field of vision or possibilities too quickly. I'd like to think, and I did some of this when I was in my business life, is let's see how many answers we can find. It's not, I know the goal was always to reach the best answer, but how many answers are there? I always remember when I was on a school board, we heard a professor teach who was creating standardized test questions for K through 12 schools. And there was a particular word problem. She used it as an example. He said, to figure out this mathematical word problem, she said there are actually 7 different strategies you could do to get to the right answer. But she said, we do have to just pick one strategy to mainly teach. So that just always stuck with me that, yeah, there are probably multiple ways to get to, quote, the right answer. Now, as opposed to just thinking about having a wide number of answers, there's also the arena of going deep with your answers. And it gets back to the Toyota production system. They always said, ask why 5 times. And we've used that in different arenas. I've heard it said differently, but as you drill down, you get to a root cause. And so sometimes just asking literally the same question over and over, you'll get deeper on it. And the final reason to think about questions is the world and the answers are always changing. And again, there's a kind of a famous quote from Albert Einstein. His teaching assistant came to him one day and showed him the exam on theoretical physics. And she said, Professor, you've got exactly the same questions as you had in last year's exam. Aren't you afraid people will just copy? He says, not to worry. In theoretical physics, the answers are different this year. So I think that's happening more and more in life, that the answer we may have had and learned by rote might not fit in today's changing world. So moving on to the questions I'm going to be asking myself. The first 3 are personal. What do I want my life to look like? Again, a colleague and teacher, Mike Kim, has said the first thing you should do for the New Year's planning is plan your free time. What time off are you going to take? And I think that's an interesting thing, because as an entrepreneur, somebody trying to build a business, you often push those things off to the sideline. And yet, as a person in my second half of life, I want free time. So I really have to be intentional about that. Another thing is I think I need to look at my life more granular. In other words, really drill down. What are the things, whether it's relationships or, I really have to plan that out, I think, or at least explore the question more than I probably have in the past, saying, okay, what do I want my health to look like? What do I want my relationships to look like? What do I want other things to look like in my life? So again, I'll hold the questions, and eventually I'll probably come to some answer for them, and maybe there'll be different answers as I go through the year. The second question is, how and where can I serve with the greatest value? Now, I've done a lot of research in the last year around Encore Careers, learned a lot of different things, but I really need to ask more people what they want. What do people want to know? What do they need to know? And in some cases, what don't they even know they want or need yet? So another arena is I want to be curious. That's actually not hard for me. I'm always curious, exploring different things. So if anything, sometimes I have to pull back on my curiosity and focus on what's next. But the other thing I think in terms of my value, I won't be the next programmer. I won't be the next data analytics expert, but there are things that I can share with people. I think of every day I read a book called The Daily Stoic. The wisdom of the Stoics from 2,000 years ago still seems to have relevance to the human condition today. So I think there's things that I've seen in life that I can help. I have to find relevant application for it, but I think there's ways I can still help people. Then the third one is, how do I make it into a reality? And for a lot of that, I'm really focusing on using the idea of Tiny Habits by B.J. Fogg. It's one of those things where, and I've explored at least a couple of these things, help me get into new routines, more productive routines, and just keep me at work, because my willpower lags. I mentioned earlier, my curiosity will lead me off down different rabbit holes. So I need some structures to help me stay focused on what I'm attempting to do. And then how do I help people? I have to use some new technologies. In my case, one of my goals this year is to get better at finding ways to use video to help connect with people and just help people. So that'll, again, be a theme, a question. How do I use video most effectively? It may or may not actually be like TikTok videos, but how do I use video effectively to help people? Now we'll move on to the questions around the Encore career. Again, the first one was, what are the key demographic issues for Encore careers? So I have done some work, as I've said earlier. There's a study by Edward D. Jones and AgeWave. They talk about two different arenas in summary. A lot of people over 65 may have their figured out, but a majority probably don't. And whether it be what they're going to do or how they're going to pay for it, all of those things are challenging. And I think another thing is COVID and the economic turmoil is really challenging people in these days. Change was going to happen fast. It's already maybe got a little bit of an acceleration to it, but change is going to happen. And you think of now, if I'm at 60 or even at my age of 72, I've got a couple of decades here possibly that I got to figure out what to do during. I saw another study that they were redefining what they called midlife. They were proposing that maybe we should consider midlife now from 35 to 75, because people are tending to be healthier, more active, more engaged up through 75. I've heard people say it won't be uncommon for people at 75 to still be somewhat full-time work in one way or another. Also recently saw a video by Mark Friedman, who helps found Encore.org. And he said in some of their studies, they had 20 million people who wanted to work on something new in this second chapter of life. But they also these people found it very challenging. They would look at what was, but then they couldn't really figure out what's next. So there's a piece around that. And that's obviously what I'm going to try to help people do, is how do we go from what was, their skills, their knowledge, their expertise, into what's next? how are we going to use that for the benefit of others? Now, another interesting thing around demographics comes from a guy by the name of Hans Rosling. He did a lot of interesting work with data visualization and demographics also. And his perspective was that when you take a global view, what often happens from what he saw was that, say, my view of people in Asia, or even people in Asia's view of me in the U.S., our perspectives of the world often are about 20 years out of date. One, I may think they're less developed, and meanwhile, people looking at the U.S. are looking at news and things that they've seen from before 2000. So it's one of those things that I think that's just an interesting thing. Hans Rosling put it in terms of geographic differences, but I think it could also be how we look at ourselves in the second half of life, how we look at young people in the first half of life. Those are the things that we have to think our perspective's a little out of date. The next question is, how can I use my knowledge of transitions and developing purpose to help people? And again, these are 2 courses I've just recently, in this last year, completed with the Modern Elder Academy. Great courses. I highly recommend them. And they really went in depth, and they had a rich array of people providing insights in these courses. I also have read articles about the Stanford Distinguished Careers Institute. And they had some interesting pieces. They had followed, and they have people in the second half of life going through their programs. And they said there seem to be 3 key factors in success. People are paying attention to their well-being, physical and mental. They're participating in community. Somehow they're being connected with people. And then they have some purpose. And that could be doesn't have to be a huge or grand purpose, but they have some particular reason that they're getting up every day to do something. Also from the MEA course, talked about this concept of ikigai. And I think it's an interesting thing. It's 4 overlapping phases, or it's a sort of a Venn diagram, but it talks about what you love to do, what you're good at doing, what you can be paid for, and what the world needs. And the idea here is that the overlap of those 4 things is where you'll have your sweet spot, where you can do the greatest good. Another thing I found out about demographics is these life stages are real. You can have different stages in different parts of life. The earlier thing I talked with Edward D. Jones, they talked about there'll be a pre-retirement or a pre-planning before you jump to the next stage of your career. There'll be a period of confusion or transition. And that's one of the things that I hope to help people minimize. Then there'll be a part where you're doing something. It'll be your next career or series of careers. And then probably there'll be a point in the last few years of your life, whatever it may be, where you're thinking more about, I'll say, legacy, different ideas, where we'll just have a different perspective in the truly later. And that could be between 80 and 90 or something. So it's not like that's going to happen right away. But there can be stages that you want to think about. How do you want to spend those next 30 years you might have? I believe, too, one of the key ideas is people have often thought of us as, when you're getting older, it's a victim. I'm a victim of age, a thing. So I think also we have to help people move from being that victim to a person with agency. I can do things. I don't know how to do it yet. I will move forward on those things. But this idea of I'm old, I'm a victim is actually a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you don't want to do it that way. The next item as part of this question is I need to explore both myself, and I've had some experience now in this, but also to share with others, how do you learn to learn? Probably people are thinking of formal education. I'll return to the university to get my degree. But man, in today's world, YouTube is out there. So this whole idea of I'll learn through YouTube versus learning in a university. There's amazing things that you can learn out there, but that takes some new strategies, and it may not be something you're used to if most of your learning occurred in a more formal setting. And finally, as part of this idea of transitions and helping people develop purpose, is I'm always intrigued by the possible role that financial planners might hold in this. A lot of people are engaging with financial planners, but somehow I think there's a role that they can play. They may be able to help us say, if you can't fully retire, here's a target income you need for 5 years or 10 years to get you through to that picture of where you can fully retire. So I think there's some interesting roles that maybe financial planners can have in this whole idea of helping people create encore careers. Then the next one I think of is key skills or technologies needed for a successful encore career. I think a couple of arenas, and I've talked about many of these before, but I want to help people and myself build the people skills we already have. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think those ever go out of style or they're not superseded, but that's something we've probably acquired with our experience through life, but we need to be building on those things. Then, yes, there's tech skills, and as I mentioned a little bit ago, YouTube, and you won't have to learn all the tech skills. You may or may not have an interest in becoming a data analyst, but you can learn some new skills. And then if you're going to be an independent worker, there's certainly business and marketing skills that you never had to pay attention to. So those are things that you can work on. And then I even think of volunteer skills. People may not want to work in commercial enterprises. They may want to work in nonprofits. But even there, it's not just you working, packing boxes at the food pantry or just delivering Meals on Wheels. You can translate the skills you used in your business life into the skills that are needed in terms of leadership and different arenas of volunteer skills. So again, I think there's an interesting area there to explore. I believe health skills. Again, we may or may not have. I certainly am guilty of this, of not taking enough care of myself. And it's one of those things where when we're busy striving in the corporate world, it's easy to let that stuff slip. But now it'll be different because we are getting older. Things will change. But I think building health skills can be something that's really helpful. And then a thing from the Modern Elder Academy, Chip Conley talks about is we should try to be a mentern. In other words, we should not only be a mentor to people, but we should also be an intern. And some of this gets back to the technology arena, but it could also because there are new and exciting different kinds of businesses today. But you need to go out and you're not just wise, but you're also curious. So you have to have that idea of being a mentor. And then building on that same idea, and in fact, Encore.org has reinvented themselves to be co-generational. And this is where everybody is intentionally saying, we could easily have 5 generations in a workplace or in our nonprofit or whatever it may be. So how do we effectively work with each other, both learn from each other and teach each other? So it's one of those things where I think co-generational working is going to be an interesting piece moving forward. Now, my final question, how can I put more definition into what a portfolio career looks like? I really got interested and excited about this. I interviewed Steve Preston, who wrote a book on portfolio careers. And if you want to go, it's a podcast episode of 133. And the subtitle of his book is How to Work for Passion, Pleasure, and Profit. But he got in that really intrigued me with this idea of you may have different streams of activities or income. It could be a changing portfolio of what you're doing in life. You may need to, at some point, evaluate what kind of a safety net do you need? How much of a safety net do you need? And I like to think maybe I can also help people be scrappy, get back to where you're just doing things with the smallest amount of funds available. It may be not looking like it did in your corporate life where there's greater resources to apply to a given situation. So that whole idea. And then the changing portfolio, just to jump back to that for a minute, Steve had some great examples where they started volunteering somewhere. And later on, they became the paid executive director of the nonprofit. Or somebody started out, they were doing something for a business, later on stepped back into a consulting role, but they later on realized they could put that type of skill that they had, say, for example, logistics or something, into a whole new arena, working with the local farmers market or something like that. So anyway, I think that whole idea of is we can reinvent the work we're doing, and it doesn't have to just be one thing. In our corporate careers, it may have just been one thing we primarily did for 50 plus hours a week. But now there could be an interesting mix of stuff. And sometimes it'll produce income, sometimes it'll just be your passion, but it can be a very interesting way to do that. And what really sparks my interest in some of these things is I'm reading the biography of Ben Franklin. And here he was in the early days of the American Republic. And he was trying all kinds of things. He had probably 4 or 5 different careers or things that he was interested in that he did at different times. So he was always looking for something else, one that was intriguing to him, and 2, in his case, he made some money at it. But he was always thinking for different things. He was a scientist, just explored the science of electricity. He was a publisher. He ended up being a diplomat. So it's one of those things where I think of people like that. He may be exceptional, but I think in today's world, it's easier for any of us to try out different things as we move forward. That's it for this episode. It went a little longer than I thought it might. But as a recap, my questions for 2023 are, in the personal arena, what do I want my life to look like? How and where can I serve with the greatest value? And how do I make that into a reality in terms of my day-to-day work? In terms of the Encore career questions, what are the key demographic issues for Encore careers? How can I use my knowledge of transitions and developing purpose to help people find theirs? What are the key skills or technologies needed for an Encore career? And how can I help people develop those? And then finally, how can I put more definition into what a portfolio career could look like? It's just an interesting thought that I really am intrigued by. And it's not something I think I'll find the answer, but I'll probably find some interesting ideas to work on during the year. So finally, with an Encore career, the rewards are great. You can be creating value in the world beyond just winning the next pickleball game. You can work when you want, where you want, and you can do the work you love. So if you're ready to get started today, please contact me at lynn@lynnfrias.com or head over to lynnfrias.com, listen to a few podcasts, and get on the email list. We'll see you soon. Thanks for listening.